The world didn't collapse into darkness overnight. It crept there slowly, step by step, through treaties inked in misplaced optimism, through silence mistaken for peace, and through men who spoke softly even as they sharpened their knives on IE. The morning of September 1st, 1939, Europe woke to a thunderous sound. It wasn't merely the roar of German tanks crossing into Poland, it was the death knell of diplomacy, the final gasp of peace. What began as a ruthless invasion became a global reckoning. The Second World War had begun, and with it, the world would never be the same again. But to understand how the world plunged into such devastation, one must first understand the ghost that haunted it, the First World War. The Great War had ended not with resolution, but with resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to be a blueprint for peace. Instead, it was a recipe for revenge. Germany, stripped of territory, burdened by reparations and shackled militarily, had not only lost a war, it had lost its pride. Into this vacuum of hope stepped a man whose very name would one day become synonymous with horror, Adolf Hitler. Born in 1889 in Austria, Hitler's early life was unremarkable. Rejected from art school, drifting through poverty and obscurity, he seemed destined to vanish into the backdrop of history. But the embers of hatred burned early in him. A hatred for Jews, for communists, for the elites, and above all, for the Treaty of Versailles, which he viewed not as a peace accord, but as a national humiliation. The economic collapse of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s transformed Germany into a breeding ground for extremism. Unemployment, hunger, and humiliation ravaged the nation, and into this chaos, Hitler's message rang clear. Germany would rise again. With calculated propaganda, fiery speeches, and brutal force, the Nazi Party clawed its way to power. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. Within months, democracy was dead, and in its place stood a regime that fused nationalism with genocide policy with terror. The world watched nervously as Germany rearmed and annexed territory. The Rhineland, Austria, then the Sudetenland. One by one, pieces of Europe were claimed under the guise of uniting German-speaking peoples. Britain and France clung desperately to a policy of appeasement, hoping that by feeding the lion it might be tamed. But Hitler wasn't after peace. He was after dominion. When he set his sights on Poland, the world finally said enough. Britain and France declared war. And just like that, the globe was engulfed in fire. The Axis powers quickly emerged. Germany, Italy under Mussolini, and Japan, each with their own imperial ambitions, united by authoritarian rule and a thirst for expansion. They weren't merely fighting for land, they were fighting for a new world order, one ruled by strength and fear. Against them stood the Allies, initially Britain and France, and later the Soviet Union and the United States. It was not a perfect alliance, born more from necessity than unity, but it was enough. Together, they faced an enemy whose cruelty knew no boundaries. As Hitler's armies swept through Europe with blitzkrieg, lightning war, Paris fell, and much of the continent buckled under the Nazi boot. But one nation stood defiant: Britain. In 1940, as German bombers darkened the skies above London, the Blitz began. For 76 consecutive nights, sirens screamed, buildings crumbled, and civilians took shelter in subway tunnels, praying the bombs wouldn't find them. Fire lit the skies, families vanished in seconds. But the British spirit, led by the indomitable Winston Churchill, held firm. His words rallied a nation on the brink. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. Churchill wasn't just a politician. He was a bulwark against despair. While others spoke of compromise, he spoke of resistance. He understood what Hitler was: a man who could not be appeased, only defeated. And far to the east, another front exploded. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, opened a theater of war so vast, so brutal, that it would consume millions. In the frozen wastelands and shattered cities of the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht met its match, the Red Army. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a turning point. It was hell on earth. From August 1942 to February 1943, the city became a graveyard. House by house, street by street, soldiers fought and died in the rubble. Hunger, frostbite, and sniper fire became the daily reality. Civilians were trapped, caught between two titanic forces, starved and bombed, yet unyielding. The German Sixth Army was encircled, starved, and ultimately forced to surrender. It was Hitler's first major defeat, and it broke the illusion of Nazi invincibility. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, a different war raged. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, dragging the United States fully into the conflict. Battles here weren't fought for capitals or cities, but for islands, tiny specks of land that held strategic value far beyond their size. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was a fortress, each battle a slaughter. The U.S. adopted a strategy of island hopping, taking key positions, building airfields, and inching ever closer to the Japanese mainland. But Japan would not yield. Their soldiers fought to the death. Their civilians were told to prefer suicide over capture. The desperation was total, the fanaticism absolute. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy became the gateway to liberation. Under relentless German fire, Allied forces stormed ashore. Soldiers drowned before reaching land. Others were gunned down in the surf. But still, they came, wave after wave, until the beachhead was secured. From there, the push into Europe began in earnest. France was freed. Belgium followed. The Nazi regime began to collapse under the weight of its own evil. And yet, as Allied troops advanced, they discovered something far more sinister than military bunkers. The concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, places where industrial-scale murder was carried out with cold efficiency. 6 million Jews, along with Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and countless others, were exterminated in what would become known as the Holocaust. Gas chambers, crematoria, mass graves. The true face of Nazi ideology was finally laid bare, and it was unspeakable. As the noose tightened around Berlin, Hitler retreated into his bunker. Surrounded by ruin, he chose death over justice. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself. A week later, Germany surrendered. In Europe, the war was over, but the Pacific War burned on. Faced with a fanatically determined enemy, the United States made a fateful decision. In August 1945, two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were obliterated by atomic bombs. In seconds, tens of thousands perished. The horror was unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the message was clear. The Emperor of Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over, but the world that emerged from the ashes was changed forever. Between 40 and 85 million lives had been lost. Soldiers, civilians, children. Entire cities were flattened. Nations were scarred. Genocide had been committed, on a scale never before imagined. It was not just a war of borders or ideologies. It had been a war for the soul of humanity. The Allied victory was not just military, it was moral. But it came at a price. The world now lived in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. The Cold War began almost immediately as the United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, became bitter rivals, dividing the globe into spheres of influence. Proxy wars, espionage, and nuclear brinkmanship would dominate the next half-century. In 1945, the United Nations was established in an effort to prevent future global conflict. It was a noble idea, cooperation over confrontation, but peace remained fragile. The lessons of World War II were etched deep, but they were not always heeded. And so we are left with the echoes of bombed-out cities and concentration camps, echoes of speeches that stirred nations and bullets that ended them, echoes of bravery, cruelty, sacrifice, and resistance. World War II was not inevitable, but it was the product of apathy, arrogance, and unchecked hatred. It taught the world what happens when evil is allowed to rise, when fear overrides courage, and when people look away. To remember the war is not to glorify it. It is to learn from it. To remember is to carry the burden of the past so that future generations never repeat it. The survivors of that war, soldiers and civilians alike, are now few in number. But their stories remain. Their pain, their triumphs, their warnings, they live on in history. And it is our responsibility not just to remember, but to act, to challenge tyranny, to speak against hatred, to defend peace, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. Because history, when forgotten, has a cruel tendency to return. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. What part of this global conflict do you think shaped our world the most? Do you see any parallels between then and now? Share your thoughts below. Start a conversation, challenge assumptions, and learn from each other. And if you want more powerful narratives like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The past has many more stories to tell, and we'll be here to tell them.